My name is Ava, and 3 years ago I left America with 2 suitcases, a laptop, and exactly $6,200 in my bank account. I moved to Europe because I believed starting over was better than staying trapped in a life that no longer made me happy. I rented a tiny apartment on Rosewood Lane in Brighton. The apartment was old and cold, with cracked white walls and a kitchen sink that leaked every night, but it was the first place that truly felt like mine. Every morning I would wake up before sunrise, make cheap coffee, and stare out the small window while promising myself that one day my life would become bigger than that little apartment. At the time, I had just joined Belridge and Holt, a 112-year-old company that was quietly collapsing behind expensive suits and polished offices. People inside the company acted normal during meetings, but fear lived everywhere. Employees whispered about layoffs in elevators, managers avoided eye contact in hallways, and every week another desk became empty. The company had lost millions of dollars, investors were losing patience, and many people believed bankruptcy was only months away. But when I looked at the numbers, I saw something different. I saw a company that could still survive if someone was willing to fight for it. So I fought. For 3 years, I worked harder than anyone around me. I stayed in the office long after midnight while cleaners vacuumed the hallways around me. I missed birthdays, holidays, and family dinners. My father, Daniel, called me every Sunday from America asking when I would finally rest, and every time I gave him the same answer: when the company survives. Slowly, things began changing. I built relationships with investors across Europe and America, fixed damaged contracts, and spent months creating a merger deal with Whitmore Global worth $4 billion. That merger would save thousands of jobs and rescue the company from total collapse. By the end of the 3rd year, only a few people fully understood the deal, and I was one of them. The final signing day arrived on a cold Monday morning in London. Rain tapped softly against the windows while employees rushed through the marble lobby carrying coffee cups and files. I wore a dark blue dress, silver earrings from my mother Elena, and the confidence of someone who had earned her place. Investors from America had already arrived, and everyone knew the meeting that morning would decide the company's future. My hands were shaking slightly as I stepped out of the elevator, but I kept reminding myself that after today, the nightmare would finally end. Then Astrid Vaughan walked into the lobby. She was the daughter of Gregory Vaughan, the company's vice president, and she carried herself like the entire building belonged to her. Her heels clicked sharply across the marble floor as conversations slowly died around us. She stopped directly in front of me and looked me up and down with cold eyes. "Your dress violates company policy," she said. I frowned in confusion. "What?" "It's too short," she replied. 3 inches above the knee. I looked around the lobby. 21 people stood nearby watching silently. Nobody spoke. Nobody defended me. Then Astrid folded her arms and said the words that changed my life forever. "You're fired." For a few seconds after Astrid fired me, I could not move. The entire lobby felt strangely quiet, like the air itself had frozen. Around us, employees pretended to look busy, but I could feel their eyes watching me. Some looked uncomfortable, some looked curious, and a few looked relieved that it was not happening to them. I stood there holding my bag while rain poured outside the glass doors of the building. 3 years of sleepless nights, sacrifices, and loyalty had just been erased in less than half an hour. Astrid crossed her arms confidently. "Security will escort you out if necessary." I stared at her for a long moment. She looked proud of herself, like she had finally proven she was important. I wanted to argue. I wanted to remind everyone in that lobby that the merger meeting upstairs could not happen without me. But something stopped me. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was disappointment. Or maybe deep inside, I already understood that a company willing to humiliate me publicly after everything I had done was not a company worth saving anymore. So instead of fighting, I simply nodded once. "All right," I said quietly. I turned and walked toward the exit while 21 people watched in silence. My heels echoed across the marble floor, each step sounding heavier than the last. Nobody stopped me. Not Marcus from legal, who had spent 2 years asking for my help on contracts. Not Olivia from finance, who once cried in my office because she feared losing her job. Not Henry Cole, the senior director who used to call me the smartest strategist in the company. They all stayed silent. Outside, cold rain immediately soaked my coat. London looked grey and distant that morning, with cars moving slowly through wet streets and people rushing under umbrellas. I stood on the sidewalk for a few seconds trying to understand what had just happened. Part of me wanted to cry, but another part of me felt strangely calm. Maybe because after 3 years of carrying the company on my shoulders, I was suddenly free from its weight. I walked several blocks through the rain until I found a small cafe called Hollow Bean near Lancaster Street. The cafe smelled like fresh bread and strong coffee. Soft music played quietly in the background while a few customers worked on laptops near the windows. I sat alone in the corner, still holding my briefcase tightly against my chest. Inside that briefcase were the final investor approvals for the merger. Without those approvals, the $4 billion deal could not close. A waitress with curly brown hair approached carefully. "You okay?" I forced a small smile. "Long morning." She nodded sympathetically and placed a cup of coffee in front of me. "First cups on the house." I thanked her softly and stared down at the coffee for almost 20 minutes without drinking it. My phone would not stop vibrating on the table beside me. First came emails, then messages, then non-stop calls. Marcus called twice. Olivia called 4 times. Henry called 7 times. I ignored every single one. At exactly 11:40 a.m., a message appeared from an unknown number. "The investors are refusing to sign. Please come back immediately." I leaned back slowly in my chair and closed my eyes. Of course they were refusing. The executives upstairs still did not understand something important. The merger had never been built only on paperwork and numbers. It had been built on trust. Over 3 years, I had personally earned the confidence of every major investor involved in the deal. I knew what worried them, what motivated them, and what promises mattered most to them. Richard Bennett trusted me because I once stayed awake for 36 hours helping save one of his companies from a disaster worth $80 million. Clara Monroe trusted me because I always told her the truth, even when it was difficult. Those investors were not investing in Belridge and Holt anymore. They were investing in me. The cafe door suddenly opened, and Henry Cole rushed inside looking pale and exhausted. Rain covered his gray coat, and his tie was hanging loosely around his neck. He spotted me immediately and walked quickly toward my table. "Ava," he said breathlessly, "thank God." I stayed silent. Henry sat down across from me. "The meeting is collapsing." I looked out the cafe window at the rainy street. "That sounds unfortunate." Astrid tried presenting the merger herself, he continued nervously. "The investors stopped the meeting after 12 minutes. I almost laughed. "She didn't even understand the second stage debt structure," I said. "I know," Henry admitted quietly. For a moment neither of us spoke. The sounds of coffee cups and quiet conversations filled the silence between us. Finally, Henry leaned forward. "Ava, we need you to come back." I looked at him carefully. He looked genuinely desperate now, not powerful. The confident senior director I had known for years suddenly looked old and tired. "You watched her fire me," I said calmly. His eyes lowered immediately. "I know." "No," I replied softly. "You knew exactly what was happening, and you said nothing." Henry rubbed his forehead heavily. "You're right." Hearing him admit it so honestly surprised me more than anything else. "The investors are threatening to walk away completely," he continued. "If this merger fails, the company may not survive another month." I finally took my first sip of coffee. It had already gone cold. Henry slowly pulled a folder from his briefcase and placed it on the table between us. "We prepared a new offer," he said carefully. I opened the folder. Double salary, full executive authority, a private office, profit shares worth millions of dollars. 3 years ago, that offer would have felt like a dream. Now it felt insulting. "They only value me because they are scared," I said quietly. Henry did not argue. "Yes," he answered honestly. That single word changed something inside me. For the first time, someone inside the company was finally telling the truth. I closed the folder gently and pushed it back toward him. "I'm not coming back." Henry's face lost all color. "Ava, please." I stood up slowly and picked up my briefcase. No company gets to destroy my dignity and then ask for my loyalty 5 minutes later. "You're making a mistake," he whispered desperately. I looked at him for a long moment before answering. "No," I said calmly. "I think this is the first good decision I've made in years." Then I walked toward the cafe door. Behind me, Henry remained frozen at the table while rain continued crashing against the windows. That evening, I returned to my tiny apartment in Brighton exhausted and emotionally numb. I changed into sweatpants, tied my hair back, and sat alone on the floor beside the couch because I was too tired to even turn on the lights. For hours I stared at the ceiling thinking about everything I had lost. My career, my reputation, my future. But sometime after midnight, another thought slowly entered my mind. What if losing that job was not the end? What if it was the beginning? I reached for my phone and searched for one name. Eleanor Brooks. An old friend from America who owned a small investment firm in Boston. My hands trembled slightly as I pressed call. She answered on the second ring. "Ava," she asked sleepily, "do you realize what time it is?" I smiled weakly for the first time all day. "Yeah," I said softly, "but I think I'm about to change my life." Eleanor Brooks flew from America to Europe 3 days after our phone call. I still remember meeting her at a quiet restaurant near the river in Manchester. The weather was cold, and grey clouds covered the sky, but Eleanor arrived smiling confidently like she always did. She wore a long black coat, carried a leather notebook under one arm, and walked into the restaurant with the energy of someone who never doubted herself. When she sat down across from me, she studied my face carefully for a few seconds. "You look exhausted," she said. "I feel worse than I look." She laughed softly. "Good. That usually means you're about to do something important." For the next 2 hours, I told her everything. I explained how Belridge and Holt had collapsed into panic after firing me, how investors no longer trusted the leadership, and how years of bad decisions had finally destroyed the company from the inside. Eleanor listened quietly without interrupting me once. Every now and then she wrote notes inside her leather notebook while waiters passed by carrying coffee and warm bread. When I finally finished speaking, she leaned back in her chair thoughtfully. "So let me understand this clearly," she said. "You built a $4 billion merger almost alone, saved a dying company, and then got fired over a dress. Basically. And now their investors are panicking because the only competent person left the building." I smiled weakly. "That's also basically correct." Eleanor shook her head slowly and laughed again. "Ava, do you realize how insane this story sounds? Every day." For a few moments she remained silent, staring out the restaurant window at the river. Then she looked back at me with sharp eyes that suddenly seemed very serious. "If you started your own company," she asked carefully, "could you beat them?" The question made my heartbeat quicken. Nobody had ever asked me that before. For years, I had spent all my energy building someone else's future. I had never stopped long enough to imagine building my own. But deep inside, I already knew the answer. "Yes," I said quietly. Eleanor nodded once, like she had expected that response all along. "Good," she replied. "Because I'm ready to invest." 2 months later, we bought an old brick building on Hawthorne Avenue in Manchester for $940,000. Most people thought we were making a terrible mistake. The building looked abandoned, with broken windows, faded paint, damaged floors, and an elevator that barely worked half the time. But when I walked through those empty rooms for the first time, I did not see a ruined building. I saw possibility. Eleanor invested $12 million into the company, and together we named it North Star Equity. The name came from something my mother used to tell me when I was young. She always said, "When life becomes dark, follow the North Star. It helps lost people find their way home." I wanted our company to become exactly that for people who felt forgotten. The first weeks were difficult. We had almost no employees, no large office furniture, and no guarantee of success. I spent mornings assembling cheap desks from instruction manuals and afternoons meeting potential clients. Sometimes I stayed in the office until 2 in the morning reviewing contracts alone while construction workers repaired walls downstairs. But for the first time in years, I felt alive. There was no fear anymore. No executives treating people like machines. No endless politics. Only work, ambition, and freedom. Slowly, people began hearing about North Star Equity. Former employees from Belridge and Holt started contacting me privately. Many had been laid off during the company's collapse. Others were simply tired of toxic leadership and wanted a fresh start. Marcus from legal joined first. Then Olivia from finance. A week later, Henry Cole shocked everyone by resigning after 31 years with Belridge and Holt. When he walked into our unfinished office carrying cardboard boxes filled with personal files, I stared at him in disbelief. "You're really leaving?" I asked. Henry smiled sadly. "I should have left years ago." As our team grew, so did our reputation. Clients appreciated something unusual about us: honesty. We did not make impossible promises. We did not hide risks behind complicated language. We treated employees with respect, and eventually people noticed the difference. Within 1 year, North Star Equity managed deals worth more than $900 million across Europe and America. Business magazines started writing articles about us. Investors who once ignored my emails now waited weeks hoping for meetings. Some mornings I would walk into the office and find reporters standing outside asking for interviews. It all felt unreal. One evening, after an exhausting day of meetings in Liverpool, I returned to my apartment in Brighton and realized something surprising. I no longer belonged there. That tiny apartment had protected me during the hardest years of my life, but now every room felt too small for the future I was building. 2 months later, I bought a beautiful stone house near Lake Silverwood outside Manchester for $3.8 million. The house had tall windows overlooking the water, wooden floors that creaked softly at night, and a massive fireplace in the living room. Behind the house stood a garden filled with white roses and lavender. Every morning, sunlight reflected across the lake while birds gathered near the shoreline. For the first time in my adult life, peace finally entered my life quietly instead of temporarily. One Sunday afternoon, my father Daniel visited from America. I picked him up from the airport myself because I wanted to see his reaction when he saw the house. During the drive, he kept staring silently out the car window at the countryside around Manchester. When we finally arrived, he stood outside the house for nearly a full minute without speaking. "You live here?" he finally asked. I laughed softly. "Yeah." He slowly walked through every room like he could not believe what he was seeing. He touched the kitchen counters, stared at the lake view, and shook his head repeatedly. That evening we sat together on the balcony drinking coffee while cold wind moved across the water. "You built all this yourself?" he asked quietly. I looked out at the lake before answering. "No," I said softly. "I survived long enough to build it." My father smiled proudly but remained silent for a while afterward. Then he asked a question I did not expect. "If Astrid apologized tomorrow," he said carefully, "would you forgive her?" I thought about it honestly. I remembered standing humiliated in that marble lobby while everyone watched silently. I remembered crying alone in my apartment after losing everything. But I also remembered something else. If Astrid had never fired me, North Star Equity would never exist. "Yes," I finally answered. My father looked surprised. "Why?" "Because hate becomes heavy after a while," I said quietly. "And I'm tired of carrying heavy things." That night, after my father went to sleep, I stood alone beside the lake under the cold European sky. The water reflected moonlight softly while distant wind moved through the trees around the house. 3 years earlier, I had stood in the rain outside Belridge and Holt believing my life was over. Now I understood something important. Sometimes the worst moment of your life is actually the moment your real life finally begins. 3 years after Astrid Vaughan fired me from Belridge and Holt, I returned to London for the Global Finance Leadership Conference, one of the biggest business events in Europe and America. By then, North Star Equity had become one of the fastest-growing investment companies in the world. Financial magazines constantly wrote stories about our success, investors competed for meetings with us, and business schools even studied our growth strategy. Sometimes it still felt unreal to me because deep inside, I was still the woman who once cried alone in a tiny apartment with cracked walls and unpaid bills. The conference was being held inside the same building where my career had nearly ended years earlier. Except now, Belridge and Holt no longer own the building. North Star Equity did. When our company purchased the property for $180 million the previous winter, reporters called it symbolic revenge. But honestly, I had not bought the building to hurt anyone. It was simply a smart investment in one of the most valuable areas of London. Still, I could not deny the strange feeling in my chest as my car stopped outside the familiar glass entrance that cold morning. Rain was falling lightly, just like it had on the day I was fired. The driver opened my door, and cameras immediately flashed around me as reporters shouted questions from behind security barriers. "Ava, how does it feel returning here? Is North Star Equity planning another billion-dollar acquisition? What's your response to rumors about expansion into America?" I smiled politely without answering and walked through the glass doors. The moment I entered the lobby, memories crashed into me all at once. The marble floors, the tall silver elevators, the front desk near the entrance. The exact spot where Astrid once stood with her arms crossed while 21 silent employees watched my humiliation. For a few seconds, I simply stood there remembering everything. I remembered how powerless I had felt walking out of that building carrying my briefcase while rain soaked my coat. I remembered sitting inside Hollow Bean Cafe wondering if my career was over forever. Most of all, I remembered the silence. The silence from people who knew I did not deserve what happened but stayed quiet because fear was easier than courage. Now the same lobby looked completely different. North Star Equity banners hung across the walls. Employees moved confidently through the building wearing company badges with our silver North Star logo. People greeted each other warmly instead of whispering nervously in corners. The atmosphere no longer felt cold or fearful. It felt alive. "Ava." I turned slowly at the sound of the voice.
Astrid Vaughn stood near the reception desk.
For a moment, neither of us moved.
She looked different than I remembered.
The sharp confidence she once carried like armor had disappeared. Her blonde hair was shorter now, and faint exhaustion showed around her eyes. She wore a simple black suit and held a thin folder tightly against her chest.
But the biggest difference was the way she looked at me. Not with arrogance. Not with superiority. With nervousness.
I walked toward her calmly while security guards nearby pretended not to stare at us.
"Hello, Astrid," I said quietly.
"Hello, Ava."
An awkward silence settled between us.
Around us, employees continued walking through the lobby, completely unaware of how much history existed in that single conversation. Finally, Astrid looked down briefly before speaking again. "I heard you'd be here today." "I'm hosting the conference," I replied gently. She nodded once.
"Right. Of course."
I noticed her hands trembling slightly around the folder she carried. "What are you doing now?" I asked. "I work for a small consulting firm in London," she answered softly. "Mostly contract work." Years ago, Astrid had walked through this building like she owned the world. Now she spoke carefully, almost cautiously, like someone who had spent years learning difficult lessons. "I deserved what happened to me," she suddenly said.
I stayed silent. She took a slow breath.
"Back then, I thought power meant controlling people. I thought leadership meant making people fear you."
She laughed bitterly at herself.
I was stupid. Hearing those words surprised me more than I expected. For years, I imagined what I would say if I ever saw Astrid again. I imagined anger. I imagined satisfaction. Part of me once hoped she would suffer the same humiliation she caused me.
But standing there now, I felt none of those things.
I only saw a human being carrying regret. "After you left," she continued quietly, "everything collapsed faster than anyone expected.
Investors pulled out. Employees resigned.
My father retired 6 months later."
She looked around the lobby slowly.
"I lost almost everything." There was no self-pity in her voice.
Just honesty.
And strangely, honesty changed everything. I leaned against the reception desk slightly and studied her face carefully. For the first time, I realized something important.
Astrid had not destroyed my life.
She had accidentally redirected it. If she had never fired me, I probably would have stayed at Belridge and Holt forever, sacrificing my happiness to save a company that never truly valued me.
North Star Equity would never exist.
Thousands of employees who now worked with us would still feel trapped inside toxic workplaces. My life by Lake Silverwood would never have happened. Painful moments often feel like endings while they are happening. But sometimes they are beginnings in disguise.
Astrid swallowed nervously.
"I know I don't deserve forgiveness."
"No," I replied calmly.
"You probably don't." Her eyes lowered immediately.
But then I smiled gently.
"Still," I continued, "I forgave you a long time ago." She looked up quickly, shocked.
"Why?" I glanced around the lobby one last time.
"Because carrying anger for years only hurts the person carrying it."
For several seconds, Astrid said nothing. Then tears slowly filled her eyes.
"I was jealous of you," she admitted quietly.
"Everyone respected you. You walked into rooms and people listened."
"I spent my whole life trying to force people to respect me because I didn't know how to earn it."
That sentence hit me harder than I expected. For the first time, I truly understood her. Not as a villain.
As someone insecure and afraid. A woman raised around power but never taught wisdom. I reached into my bag, removed one of my business cards, and handed it to her.
She stared at it in confusion.
"What's this?" "If you ever want a fresh start," I said softly, "call me."
Her eyes widened slightly.
"You'd actually help me after everything."
I smiled. People helped me when I needed it most.
Someone should do the same for you. At that exact moment, applause suddenly echoed from the ballroom upstairs as the conference opening ceremony began.
An employee hurried toward me nervously.
"Ms. Ava, everyone's waiting for your speech."
I nodded politely before turning back toward Astrid.
She looked overwhelmed, emotional, almost unable to speak.
"Thank you," she whispered finally.
I gave her one final smile before walking toward the elevators. And as the elevator doors closed, I realized something important. The best revenge was never destroying the people who hurt you.